Blind each other, what do I care, says McGrew. You can't see nothing anyways. Columbus win the exhibition game 3-2, whilst McGrew sat in the dugout muttering and cursing like a 14-year-old Scotty. He bad-mouthed everybody on the ball club, and he bad-mouthed everybody off of the ball club, including the Wright brothers, who, he claimed, had yet to build an airship big enough for any of our boys to hit it with a ball bat. I wished I was dead, he says to me. I wished I was in heaven with the angels. I told him to pull himself together, 'cause he was driving the boys crazy the way he was going on, sulking and bad-mouthing and whining. I was older than he was and smarter than he was, and he knowed it. I was 10 times smarter than he was about this Pearl de Monville. First time I ever laid eyes on the little guy, which was one of the saddest days of my life. Now, most people name a Pearl as girls, but this Pearl de Monville was a man, if you could call a fella a man who was only 34, 35 inches high. Pearl de Monville was a midget. He was part French and part Hungarian, and maybe even part Bulgarian or something. I can see him now, a sneer on his little pushed-in pan, swinging a bamboo cane and smoking a big cigar. He had a gray suit with a big black check into it, and he had a gray felt hat with one of them rainbow-colored hat bands onto it, like the young fellas wore in them days. He talked like he was talking into a tin can, but he didn't have no foreign accent. He might have been 15, or he might have been 100, you couldn't tell. Pearl de Monville. After the game with Columbus, McGrew headed straight for the Chittenden bar. The train for St. Louis wasn't going for 3-4 hours, and there he sat, drinking rye and talking to this bartender. How I pity me, brother, McGrew was telling this bartender, how I pity me. That was always his favorite tune. So he was sitting there telling this bartender how heartbreaking it was to be manager of a bunch of blindfolded circus clowns, when up pops this Pearl de Monville out of nowheres. It give McGrew the leaping jumps. He thought at first maybe the DTs had come back on him. He claimed he'd had 'em once, and little guys had popped up all around him wearing red, white, and blue hats. Go on now, McGrew yells. Get away from me. But the midget clumb up on a chair across the table from McGrew and says, I seen that game today, Junior, and you ain't got no ball club. What you got there, Junior, he says, is a sideshow. What do you mean, Junior, says McGrew, touching the little guy to satisfy himself he was real. Don't pay him no attention, mister, says the bartender. Pearl calls everybody Junior, 'cause it always turns out he's a year older than anybody else. Yeah, says McGrew. How old is he? How old are you, Junior, says the midget. Who, me? I'm 53, says McGrew. Well, I'm 54, says the midget. McGrew grins and asks him what he'll have, and that was the beginning of their beautiful friendship, if you don't care what you say. Pearl de Monville stood up on his chair and waved his cane around and pretended like he was ballyhooing for a circus. Right this way, folks, he yells. Come on in and see the greatest collection of freaks in the world. See the armless pitchers. See the eyeless batters. See the infielders with 5 thumbs, and on like that, feeding McGrew gall and handing him a laugh at the same time, you might say. You could hear him and Pearl de Monville hooting and hollering and singing way up to the 4th floor of the Chittenden, where the boys was packing up. When it come time to go to the station, you can imagine how disgusted we was when we crowded into the doorway of that bar and seen them two singing and going on. Well, 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 says McGrew, looking up and spotting us. Look who's here. Clowns, this is Pearl de Monville, a monsieur of the old school. Don't shake hands with 'em, Pearl, 'cause their fingers is made of chalk and would bust right off in your paws, he says. And he starts guffawing, and Pearl starts tittering, and we stand there giving him the iron eye, it being the lowest ebb a ball club manager'd got hisself down to since the national pastime was started. Then the midget begun giving us the ballyhoo. Come on in, he says, waving his cane. See the legless base runners. See the outfielders with the butterfingers. See the southpaw with the arm of little child. Then him and McGrew begun to hoop and holler and nudge each other till you'd have thought this little guy was the funniest guy than even Charlie Chaplin. The fellas filed out of the bar without a word and went on up to the Union Depot, leaving me to handle McGrew and his newfound crony. Well, I got him out of there finally. I had to take the little guy along 'cause McGrew had a holt onto him like a vice, and I couldn't pry him loose. He's coming along as mascot, says McGrew, holding the midget in the crotch of his arm like a football. And come along he did, hollering and protesting and beating at McGrew with his little fists. Cut it out, will you, Junior? The little guy kept whining. "Come on, leave a man loose, will you, Junior?" But Junior kept a holt onto him and begun yelling, "See the guys with the glass arm! See the guys with the cast-iron brains! See the fielders with the feet on their wrists!" So it goes, right through the whole Union Depot, with people staring and catcalling, and he don't put the midget down till he gets him through the gates. "How am I going to go along without no toothbrush?" the midget asks. "What am I going to do without no other suit?" he says. "Doc here," says McGrew, meaning me, "Doc here will look after you like you was his own son, won't you, Doc?" I give him the iron eye, and he finally got on the train and probably went to sleep with his clothes on. This left me alone with the midget. "Look it," I says to him, "why don't you go on home now? Come morning, McGrew'll forget all about you. He'll probably think you was something he seen in a nightmare, maybe. And he ain't gonna laugh so easy in the morning, neither," I says, "so why don't you go on home?" "Nix," he says to me. "Skidoo," he says, "23 for you." And he tosses his cane up into the vestibule of the coach and clambers on up after it like a cat. So that's the way Pearl de Monville come to go to St. Louis with the ball club. I seen 'em first at breakfast the next day, settin' opposite each other, the midget playin' Turkey in the Straw on a harmonium, and McGrew staring at his eggs and bacon like they was an uncooked bird with its feathers still on. "Remember where you found this?" I says, jerking my thumb at the midget. "Or maybe you think they come with breakfast on these trains," I says, being a good hand at turning a sharp remark in them days. The midget puts down the harmonium and turns on me. "Sneeze," he says, "your brains is dusty." Then he snaps a couple of drops of water at me from a tumbler. "Drown," he says, trying to make his voice deep. Now, both them cracks is Civil War cracks, but you'd have thought they was brand new and the funniest that any crack McGrew'd ever heard in his whole life. He started hoopin' and hollerin', and the midget started hoopin' and hollerin', so I walked on away and sat down with Bugs Courtney and Hank Meters, paying no attention to this weak-minded Damon and Phidias across the aisle. Well, sir, the first game with St. Louis was rained out, and there we was facing a doubleheader next day. Like maybe I told you, we lost the last 3 doubleheaders we play, making maybe 25 errors in the 6 games, which is all right for the inmates of a school for the blind, but is disgraceful for the world's champions. It was too wet to go to the zoo, and McGrew wouldn't let us go to the movies 'cause they flickered so bad in them days, so we just sat around stewing and frettin'. One of the newspaper boys come over to take a picture of Billy Klinger and Whitey Cott shaking hands. This reporter'd heard about the fight, and whilst they was standing there toe-to-toe shaking hands, Billy give a back lunge and a jerk and throwed Whitey over his shoulder into a corner of the room like a sack of salt. Whitey come back at him with a chair, and Bethlehem broke loose in that there room. The camera was tromped to pieces like a berry basket. When we finally got 'em pulled apart, I heard a laugh, and there was McGrew and the midget standing in the door and giving us the iron eye. "Rasslers," says McGrew, cold-like. "That's what I got for a ball club, Mr. Dumonville, rasslers, and not very good rasslers at that, you asked me." "A man can't be good at everything," says Pearl, "but he ought to be good at something." This sets McGrew guffawing again, and away they go, the midget tagging along by his side like a hound dog, and handing him a fast line of so-called comic cracks. When we went out to face that battlin' St. Louis club in a doubleheader the next afternoon, the boys was jumpy as tin toys with keys in their back. We lose the first game, 7-2, and are trailin' 4-0, when the second game ain't but 10 minutes old. McGrew sat there like a stone statue, speaking to nobody. Then in their half of the fourth, somebody singled to center and knocked in 2 more runs for St. Louis. More runs for St. Louis. Give him a fast line of so-called comic cracks. When we went out to face that battlin' St. Louis club in a doubleheader the next afternoon, the boys was jumpy as tin toys with keys in their back. We lose the first game, 7-2, and are trailin' 4-0, when the second game ain't but 10 minutes old. McGrew sat there like a stone statue, speaking to nobody. Then in their half of the fourth, somebody singled to center and knocked in 2 more runs for St. Louis. That made McGrew squawk. "I wished one thing," he says. "I wished I was manager of a old ladies' sewing circus instead of a ball club." "You are, Junior, you are," says a familiar and disagreeable voice. It was that Pearl de Monville again, popping up out of nowheres, swinging his bamboo cane and smoking a cigar that's 3 sizes too big for his face. By this time, we finally got the other side out, and Hank Meters slithered a bat across the ground, and the midget had to jump to keep both his ankles from being broke. I thought McGrew'd bust a blood vessel. "You hurt, Pearl, and I'll break your neck," he yelled. Hank muttered something and went on up to the plate and struck out. We managed to get a couple of runs across in our half of the sixth, but they come back with 3 more in their half of the seventh, and this was too much for McGrew. "Come on, Pearl," he says. "We're getting out of here." "Where you think you're going?" I asked him. "To the lawyers again," he says cryptically. "I didn't know you'd been to the lawyers once yet," I says. "Which that goes to show how much you don't know," he says. With that, they was gone, and I didn't see 'em the rest of the day, nor know what they was up to, which was a God's blessing. We lose the nightcap 9-3, and that puts us into second place plenty, and as low in our mind as a ball club can get. The next day was a horrible day, like anybody that lived through it can tell you. Practice was just over, and the St. Louis club was taking the field, when I hears this strange sound from the stands. It sounds like the nervous whickering a horse gives when he smells something funny on the wind. It was the fans catching sight of Pearl de Monville, like you have probably guessed. The midget had popped up onto the field, all dressed up in a miniature club uniform, socks, cap, little letters sewed onto his chest and all. He was swinging a kid's bat, and the only thing kept him from looking like a real ball player seen through the wrong end of a microscope was the cigar he was smoking. Bugs Courtney reached over and jerked it out of his mouth and throwed it away. "You're wearing that suit on the playing field," he says to him, severe as a judge. "You go insulting it, and I'll take you out to the zoo and feed you to the bears." Pearl just blowed some smoke at him, which he still had in his mouth. Whilst Whitey was fouling off 4 or 5 prior to striking out, I went on over to McGrew. "If I was as comic as you," I says, "I'd laugh myself to death," I says. "Is that any way to treat the uniform, making a mockery out of it?" "It might surprise you to know I ain't making no mockery out of the uniform," says McGrew. "Pearl de Monville here has been made a bona fide member of this so-called ball club. I fixed it up with the front office by long-distance phone." "Yeah," I says, "I can just hear Mr. Dilworth or Bart Jenkins agreeing to hire a midget for the ball club. I can just hear 'em." Mr. Dilworth was the owner of the club, and Bart Jenkins was the secretary, and they never stood for no monkey business. "May I be so bold as to inquire," I says, "just what you told him?" "I told him," he says, "I wanted to sign up a guy that ain't no pitcher in the league can strike him out." "Uh-huh," I says, "and did you tell him what size of a man he is?" "Never mind about that," he says. "I got papers on me, made out legal and proper, constituting one Pearl de Monville a bona fide member of this former ball club. Maybe that'll shame them big babies into getting in there and swinging, knowing I can replace any one of 'em with a midget if I have a mind to. A St. Louis lawyer I seen twice tells me it's all legal and proper." "A St. Louis lawyer would," I says, "seeing nothing could make him happier than having you making a mockery out of this one-time baseball outfit," I says. "Well, sir, it'll all be there in the papers of 31 years ago, and you could look it up. The game went along without no scoring for 7 innings. And since they ain't nothing much to watch but guys popping up or striking out, the fans pay most of their attention to the goings-on of Pearl de Monville. He's out there in front of the dugout, turning handsprings, balancing his bat on his chin, walking an imaginary line, and so on. The fans clapped and laughed at him, and he ate it up. So it went up to the last of the 8th, nothing to nothing, no more'n 7-8 hits all told, and no errors on neither side. Our pitcher gets the first 2 men out easy in the 8th. Then up come a fella named Porter or Billings or some such name, and he lammed one up against the tobacco sign for 3 bases. The next guy up slapped the first ball out into left for a base hit, and in come the fella from third for the only run of the ball game so far. The crowd yelled, the look of death come onto McGrew's face again, and even the midget quit his tomfooling. Their next man fouled out back of third, and we come up for our last bats like a bunch of schoolgirls stepping into a pool of cold water. I was lower in my mind than I'd been since the day in 1904, when Chesbro throwed the wild pitch in the 9th inning with a man on third and lost the pennant for the Highlanders. I knowed something just as bad was going to happen, which shows I'm a clairvoyant, or was then. When Gordy Mills hit out to second, I just closed my eyes. I opened them up again to see Dutch Muller standing on second, dusting off his pants, him having got his first hit in maybe 20 times to the plate. Next up was Harry Lessing, batting for our pitcher, and he got a base on balls, walking on a 4th one you could have combed your hair with. Then up come Whitey Cott, our leadoff man. He crouches down in what was probably the most fearsome stance in organized ball, but all he could do is pop out to short. That brung up Billy Klinger with 2 down and a man on first and second. Billy took a cut at one. You could have knocked a plug hat off of this here Carnero with it. But then he gets sense enough to wait him out, and finally he walks 2, filling the bases. Yes, sir, there you are, the tying run on third and the winning run on second. First of the ninth, 2 men down, and Hank Metters coming in to bat. Hank was built like a Pope Hartford, and he couldn't run no faster than President Taft. But he had 5 home runs to his credit for the season, and that wasn't bad in them days. Hank was still hitting better than anybody else on the ball club, and it was mighty heartening seeing him striding up towards the plate, but he never got there. "Wait a minute," yells McGrew, jumping to his feet. "I'm sending in a pinch hitter," he yells. You could have heard a bomb drop. When a ball club manager says he's sending in a pinch hitter for the best batter on the club, you know and I know and everybody knows he's lost his holt. "They're going to be sending the funny wagon for you if you don't watch out," I says, grabbing a hold of his arm. But he pulled away and run out towards the plate yelling, "Dumonville battin' for Metters." All the fellas begun squalling at once except Hank, and he just stood there staring at McGrew like he'd gone crazy and was claiming to be Ty Cobb's grandma or something. Their pitcher stood out there with his hands on his hips and a disagreeable look on his face, and the plate umpire told McGrew to go on and get a batter up. McGrew told him again Dumonville was batting for Metters, and the St. Louis manager finally got the idea. It brung him out of his dugout, howling and bawling like he'd lost a female dog and her 7 pups. McGrew pushed the midget towards the plate, and he says to him, "Just stand up there and hold that bat on your shoulder. They ain't a man in the world can throw 3 strikes in there 'fore he throws 4 balls, he says. "I get it, Junior," says the midget. "He'll walk me and force in the tie and run." And he starts on up to the plate as cocky as if he was Willie Keeler. I don't need to tell you, Bethlehem broke loose on that there ball field. The fans got onto their hind legs, yelling and whistling, and everybody on the field begun waving their arms and hollering and shoving. The plate umpire stalked over to McGrew like a traffic cop, wagging his jaw and pointing his finger, and the St. Louis manager kept yelling like his house was on fire. When Pearl got up to the plate and stood there, the pitcher slammed his glove down onto the ground and started stomping on it, and they ain't nobody can blame him. He's just walked 2 normal-sized human beings, and now here's a guy up to the plate they ain't more than 20 inches between his knees and his shoulders. The plate umpire called in the field umpire, and they talked a while, like a couple doctors seeing the bucolic plague or something for the first time. Then the plate umpire come over to McGrew with his arms folded across his chest, and he told him to go on and get a batter up or he'd forfeit the game to St. Louis. He pulled out his watch, but somebody batted it out of his hand in the scuffling, and I thought there'd be a free-for-all with everybody yelling and shoving except Pearl Dumonville, who stood up at the plate with his little bat on his shoulder, not moving a muscle. Then McGrew played his ace. I seen him pull some papers out of his pocket and show 'em to the plate umpire. The umpire begun looking at him like they was bills for something he not only never bought it, he never even heard of it. The other umpires studied him like they was a death warrant, and all this time the St. Louis manager and the fans and the players is yelling and hollering. Well, sir, they fought about him being a midget, and they fought about him using a kid's bat, and they fought about where'd he been all season. They was 8 or 9 rule books brung out, and everybody was thumbing through 'em trying to find out what it says about midgets, but it don't say nothing about midgets, 'cause this was something never'd come up in the history of the game before, and nobody'd ever dreamed about it, even when they had nightmares. Maybe you can't send no midgets into bat nowadays, 'cause the old game's changed a lot, mostly for the worst, but you could then, it turned out. The plate umpire finally decided the contract papers was all legal and proper, like McGrew said, so he waved the St. Louis players back to their places, and he pointed his finger at their manager and told him to quit hollering and get on back in the dugout. The manager says the game is proceeding under protest, and the umpire bawls, "Play ball," over and above the yelling and booing, him having a voice like a hog caller. The St. Louis pitcher picked up his gloves and beat at it with his fist 6 or 8 times, and then got set on the mound and studied the situation. The fans realized he was really going to pitch to the midget, and they went crazy, hooping and hollering louder than ever, and throwing pop bottles and hats and cushions down onto the field. It took 5-10 minutes to get the fans quieted down again, whilst our fellows that was on base sat down on the bags and waited. and Pearl de Monville kept standing up there with the bat on his shoulder like he'd been told to. So the pitcher starts studying the setup again, and you got to admit it was the strangest setup in a ball game since the players cut off their beards and begun wearing gloves. I wished I could call the pitcher's name. It wasn't old Barney Pelty, nor Nig Jack Powell, nor Harry Howell. He was a big right-hander, but I can't call his name. You could look it up. Even in a crouching position, the catcher towers over the midget like the Washington Monument. The plate umpire tries standing on his tiptoes, then he tries crouching down, and he finally gets himself into a stance nobody had ever seen on a ball field before, kind of squatting down on his haunches. Well, the pitcher is sore as an old buggy horse in fly time. He slams in the first pitch hard and wild, and maybe 2 foot higher than the midget's head. "Ball 1, hollers the umpire over and above the racket, 'cause everybody is yelling worse than ever. The catcher goes on out towards the mound and talks to the pitcher and hands him the ball. This time the big right-hander tries a undershoot, and it comes in a little closer, maybe no higher than a foot and a half above Pearl's head. It would have been a strike with a human being in there, but the umpire's got to call it, and he does. "Ball 2, he bellers. The catcher walks on out to the mound again, and the whole infield comes over and gives advice to the pitcher about what they'd do in a case like this with 2 balls and no strikes on a batter that ought to be in a bottle of alcohol instead of up there at the plate in a big league game between the teams that is fighting for first place. For the 3rd pitch, the pitcher stands there flat-footed and tosses up the ball like he's playing catch with a girl. Pearl stands there motionless as a hitching post, and the ball comes in big and slow and high for Pearl, that is. It'd be in about on a level with his eyes, or a little higher than a grown man's knees. They ain't nothing else for the umpire to do, so he calls ball 3. Everybody is onto their feet, hooping and hollering as the pitcher sets to throw ball 4. The St. Louis manager is making signs and faces like he was a contorturer, and the infield is giving the pitcher some more advice about what to do this time. Our boys who was on base stick right onto the bag, running no risk of being nipped for the last out. Well, the pitcher decides to give him a toss again, seeing he come closer with that than with the fastball. They ain't nobody ever seen a slower ball throwed. It come in big as a balloon and slower than any ball ever throwed before in the major leagues. It come right in over the plate in front of Pearl's chest, looking probably big as a full moon to Pearl. They ain't never been a minute like the minute that followed since the United States was founded by the Pilgrim grandfathers. Pearl de Monville took a cut at that ball, and he hit it. McGrew give a groan like a pole-axed steer as the ball rolls out in front of the plate into fair territory. "Fair ball," yells the umpire, and the midget starts running for first, still carrying that little bat and making maybe 90 foot an hour. Bethlehem breaks loose on that ball field, and in them stands, they ain't never been nothing like it since creation was begun. The ball's rolling slow on down towards 3rd, going maybe 8 to 10 foot. The infield comes in fast, and our boys break from their bases like hares in a brush fire. Everybody is standing up, yelling and hollering, and McGrew is tearing his hair out of his head, and the midget is scampering for first with all the speed of one of them little dash hounds carrying a satchel in his mouth. The catcher gets to the ball first, but he boots it on out past the pitcher's box, the pitcher falling on his face trying to stop it, the shortstop sprawling after it, full length and zagging it on over towards the second baseman, whilst Muller is scoring with the tie-in run, and Lessing is rounding 3rd with a winning run. Ty Cobb could have made a 3-bagger out of that bunt, with everybody falling over theirselves trying to pick the ball up. But Pearl is still maybe 15, 20 feet from the bag, toddling like a baby, and yeeping like a trapped rabbit, when the second baseman finally gets a hold of that ball and slams it over to first. The first baseman catches it and stomps on the bag. The base umpire waves Pearl out, and there goes your old ball game. The craziest ball game ever played in the history of the organized world. Their players start running in, and then I see McGrew. He starts after Pearl, running faster than any man ever run before. Pearl sees him coming and runs behind the base umpire's legs and gets a hold onto him. McGrew comes up, panting and roaring, and him and the midget plays ring around the rosy with the umpire, who keeps shoving at McGrew with one hand and trying to slap the midget loose from his legs with the other. Finally, McGrew catches the midget, who is still yeeping like a stuck sheep. He gets hold of that little guy by both his ankles and starts whirling him round and round his head like McGrew was a hammer thrower and Pearl was the hammer. Nobody can stop him without getting their head knocked off, so everybody just stands there and yells. Then McGrew lets the midget fly. He flies on out towards second, high and fast like a human home run, headed for the soap sign in center field. Their shortstop tries to get to him, but he can't make it. And I knowed the little fellow was going to bust to pieces like a dollar watch on an asphalt street when he hit the ground. But it so happens their center fielder is just crossing second, and he starts running back, trying to get under the midget, who had took to spiraling like a football instead of turning head over foot, which give him more speed and more distance. I know you never seen a midget catched, and you probably never even seen one throwed. To catch a midget that's been throwed by a heavy-muscled man and is flying through the air, you got to run under him and with him, and pull your hands and arms back and down when you catch him to break the compact of his body, or you'll bust him in two like a matchstick. I seen Bill Lang and Willie Keeler and Tris Speaker make some wonderful catches in my day, but I never seen nothing like that center fielder. He goes back and still further back, and he pulls that midget down out of the air like he was lifting a sleeping baby from a cradle. They wasn't a bruise onto him, only his face was the color of cat's meat, and he ain't got no air in his chest. In his excitement, the base umpire, who was running back with the center fielder when he catched Pearl, yells, "Out!" and that gives hysterics to the Bethlehem, which was raging like Niagara on that ball field. Everybody was hooping and hollering and yelling and running with the fans swarming onto the field and the cops trying to keep order, and some guys laughing and some of the women fans crying, and 6 or 8 of us holding on to McGrew to keep him from getting at that midget and finishing him off. Some of the fans picks up the St. Louis pitcher and the center fielder and starts carrying him around on their shoulders, and they was the craziest goings-on knowed to the history of organized ball on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. I seen Pearl de Monville struggling in the arms of a lady fan with an ample bosom who was laughing and crying at the same time, and him beating at her with his little fists and bawling and yelling. He clawed his way loose finally and disappeared in the forest of legs, which made that ball field look like it was Coney Island on a hot summer's day. That was the last I ever seen of Pearl de Monville. I never seen hide nor hair of him from that day to this, and neither did nobody else. He just vanished into the thin of the air, as the fella says. He was catched for the final out of the ball game, and that was the end of him, just like it was the end of the ball game, you might say, and also the end of our losing streak, like I'm going to tell you. That night, we piled onto a train for Chicago, but we wasn't snarling and snapping anymore. No, sir, the ice was finally broke, and a new spirit come into that ball club. The old zip come back with the disappearance of Pearl de Monville out back of second base. We got to laughing and talking and kidding together, and for long McGrew was laughing with us. He got a human look onto his pan again, and he quit whining and complaining and wishing he was in heaven with the angels. Well, sir, we wiped up that Chicago series, winning all 4 games and making 17 hits in one of them. Funny thing was, St. Louis was so shook up by that last game with us, they never did hit their stride again. Their center fielder took to misjudging everything that come his way, and the rest of the fellows followed suit, the way a club will do when one guy blows up. Before we left Chicago, I and some of the fellows went out and bought a pair of them little baby shoes, which we had 'em golded over, and give 'em to McGrew for a souvenir, and he took it all in good spirit. Whitey Cott and Billy Klinger made up and was fast friends again, and we hit our home lot like a ton of dynamite, and they was nothing could stop us from then on. I don't recollect things as clear as I did 30-40 year ago. I can't read no fine print no more, and the only person I got to check with on the golden days of the national pastime, as the fella says, is my friend old Milt Klein over in Springfield, and his mind ain't as strong as it once was. He gets Rube Waddell mixed up with Rube Marquand, for one thing, and anybody does that ought to be put away where he won't bother nobody. So I can't tell you the exact margin we win the pennant by. Maybe it was 2.5 games, or maybe it was 3.5. But it'll all be there in the newspapers and record books of 30-31 year ago, and like I was saying, you could look it up. Footnote on the future. The scientists, in spite of everything, have begun to look optimistically into the future of man and of the universe. Just when I had been led to believe that the human being and his planet had no more hope of a prolonged and improved existence than a lace valentine in hell, word is brought to me by my page boys that neither the sun nor the mind of man is, after all, going out. Unlimited supplies of hydrogen atoms have been discovered in the sun, and billions of unused brain cells have been detected in the cortex of man. The scientists who look beyond the little menaces of the mundane moment are quite naturally cheerful. I remember when the scientists were not so cheerful. I remember when man and his flimsy globe were doomed. I had become, before the good news arrived, a timid eschatologist, quietly waiting for the finish of this fragile Luna moth we call mortality. In 1910, when I was a stripling of 16 going on 17, the bearded watchers of the skies, at least those in the Middle West, fondly predicted that Halley's Comet was going to strike the planet a staggering blow somewhere between Boise and Boston, knocking it far out into the oblivious darkness, the incomprehensible cold. Nothing happened except that I was left with a curious twitching of my left ear after sundown, and a tendency to break into a dog trot at the striking of a match or the flashing of a lantern. In the decade that followed the destruction of the world by Mr. Halley's recurrent monument, there were various cosmic alarms and flourishes, mainly dealing with the odds-on probability that the sunspots, which were spreading as rapidly as ulcerative gingivitis, would before long turn the sun into a monstrous black cinder, which for several million years would give off a faint buzzing sound, but no heat at all. In the immeasurable sphere of this cold, colossal buzzing, no leaf would stir, no voice would cry, there would be no ear to listen. It was at this period that I began to compose what an old city editor for whom I worked called morbid poems. In 1933, I think it was, anyway it was after my best years had been spent, so I didn't worry so much, the universe was reported to be shrinking at an appalling rate, and we were given only a few paltry eons to prepare our species for the end, a handful of millenniums before the indescribable boundaries should close in on us, smothering without malice or favor gold star mothers, collectors of internal revenue, and little laughing girls on their way to school. Since 1933, as everyone knows, we have been imperiled by widely assorted threats of extinction, mainly the even money chance that the topsoil of the world, in one vast, restless conspiracy of movement, would bury us all, like Leptis Magna, under its soft and whispering oblivion. The menaces to God's wonderful clockwork have all passed, like the great noise over Brooklyn. The universal goose now hangs high. After long and painstaking research, Professor Hans Bethe of Cornell has come out with the announcement that the sun has enough hydrogen atoms to last it 12,000 million years. There is cheerful news, too, from other cosmic fronts. The topsoil of the Earth seems to have settled down, or at least to be biding its time. The universe has quit shrinking, and may indeed even be expanding, although I don't think so. And a Kansas scientist reports that when Halley's Comet gets back in 1985, it will be so frayed and fuzzy that it won't be able to cause any really serious trouble. I will be 90 when Halley's Comet gets back, and will no longer much care what happens. I may even be disappointed, in my querulous nonagenarian way, if the famous visitor does not deal California a glancing backhand blow before it goes careening off again into the illimitable spaces upon its unfathomable rounds. Now that man, in spite of his sins, stands a fair chance of lasting another 12,000 million years, other things being equal, it might be interesting to speculate on what he is going to be like at the end of that time, or even in 1/12,000th of that time. There is always, of course, the chance, sun or no sun, that the insects may get him within the next 200 or 300 years, but after worrying about this since 1907, I have come to the conclusion that man will finally master the tiny creatures in spite of their greater agility and superior cleverness. My confidence in man's ultimate supremacy over the weevil and the slug has been greatly strengthened by the findings of the late Dr. Frederick Tilney, the eminent brain specialist. After many years of research, Dr. Tilney came to the conclusion that man is using only 1/4 of his stock of 14 billion brain cells. In short, he is using only 3,500,000,000 brain cells. Offhand, to the layman, to you and me, this might seem like a great many brain cells to be using, since it runs into 10 figures, and we Americans are impressed by anything that runs into more than 4. We must, however, fight against the kind of complacency which would lead us to sit back and be satisfied with the use of only 3.5 billion brain cells. When we wake up in the morning, we should not say to ourselves gleefully, "I am using more than 3 billion brain cells. Good Lord, think of it." We should, on the contrary, say, "I am using only 1/4 of the brain cells with which a generous providence has provided me. Is that any way to live, for God's sake?" It was Dr. Tilney's belief that when man begins to use all his brain cells, in 1,000 years, say, or 10 million, he will become wise enough to put an end to wars, depressions, recessions, and allied evils. Dr. Tilney seemed to believe that a man 4 times as mentally powerful as we are today would, if handed a rifle by some throwback major who was still using only 3.5 billion brain cells, exclaim, "Don't be a forthwit, my man," and refuse to go to war. I am sorry that I cannot go the whole way with Dr. Tilney in his sanguine prophecies. What, I keep saying to myself, is to keep man from becoming 4 times as ornery, 4 times as sly and crafty, 4 times as full of devilishly ingenious devices for the extinction of his species. In the history of mankind, the increase of no kind of power has, so far as I can find out, ever moved naturally and inevitably in the direction of the benign. It has, as a matter of fact, almost always tended in the direction of the malignant. Don't ask me why, it just has. This tendency, it seems to me, would be especially true of the power of the mind, since it is that very power which is behind all the deviltry man is now up to, and always has been up to. Let us turn our attention for a moment to those prehistoric Americans, Sandia Man, Folsom Man, and the Minnesota Maid, whose fossilized remains have been dug up from the substrata of this ancient continent. I have no way of knowing for sure, but I venture to say that the cells which were actually functioning in the brains of Sandia, Folsom, and the Maid did not number more than 875 million, or about 1/4 as many as are working today in your brain, or mine, or Mussolini's. Now it should follow, if Dr. Tilney was on sound ground, that the man of today is 4 times as pacific, and 4 times as economically sound as Sandia and Folsom. Anybody who has more than 1,100 cells working in his cortex knows that this is not true. Man, as pacifist and economist, has gone steadily from bad to worse with the development of his brain power through the ages. I view with alarm, therefore, any future increase of his cortical activity. Let us proceed to another dolorous conclusion. Time, the weekly scientific journal, reported some time ago that the Minnesota Maid apparently fell or was thrown into a glacial period lake. How Time, always infallible, knew that the Maid either fell or was thrown into the lake, I don't know. I should have thought there was also the possibility that, driven to distraction by people who were using only 875 million brain cells, she may have swum quietly out into the lake to drown of her own accord. Now you would think, if Dr. Tilney was right, that the increase of man's functioning brain cells in the millions of years which have elapsed since the Maid's death would have prompted man to refrain from throwing woman into lakes. This is unhappily not the case. I estimate, after sitting for half an hour thinking, that more than 4 times as many women are thrown into lakes in America nowadays as were thrown into them during the era in which the Minnesota Maid lived. How many, at this rate of increase, will be thrown into American lakes 12,000 million years from now, I leave to your imagination. The only note of cheer I can strike in conclusion is to point out the possibility that, in spite of Dr. Tilney's beliefs, man may never be able to use more than 1/4 of his brain cells. In that case, he is not likely to become much more troublesome than he is now. He is certain, at any rate, not to become 4 times as troublesome. This is, I know, not much in the way of hope for the future, but it is, after all, something. At any rate, it is all I have to offer. You may all file out quietly now, with the exception of Miss Winthrop, whom I should like to see for a few moments after class. Miss Winthrop may not be aware of it, but the little song she has chosen to compose especially for this occasion has not been lost upon my ears. I refer, Miss Winthrop, to the Japanese Sandia Man, which you have been singing quite audibly during the last half hour of my lecture. The rest of you may go. The Gentleman in 916. One of my remarkable collection of colored maids wrote me a letter the other day. This girl, named Maisie, is the one who caused my hair to whiten overnight a few years ago by telling me when I got home one gloomy November evening, tired and jumpy, that there was something wrong with the doom-shaped thing in the kitchen. This monstrous menace turned out, too late to save my reason, to be the dome, to her, shaped thing on top of the electric icebox. Maisie's letter went along quietly enough for 2 paragraphs, listing the physical woes of herself and her family, a rather staggering list, to be sure, but containing nothing to cause my white hair to stand on end. And then came an alarming sentence. "I tried to see you in December," she wrote, "but the timekeeper said you were in Florida." This was the first news I had had that there was a man holding a watch on me. All my doom-shaped fears came back with a rush. It is true that I was not in Florida at the time, but this did not comfort me. I could only guess that the man who is watching the sands run through my hourglass is not really on the job. "What difference does it make where this bird is?" he probably said to himself. "He hasn't got many hours left, so why should I bother following him around? I'll just sit here and watch the clock." There are times, however, when I think he is keeping track, that he is right in the room with me. Since I have for the time being about 1/50th vision, I can't actually see him, but I can hear him. It is no illusion that the blind become equipped with the eardrums of an elk hound. I can hear a pin drop on a carpet. It makes two sounds, a sharp plop when it strikes the carpet, and a somewhat smaller sound, a faint thip, when it bounces and strikes again. It is because of acute sharpness of ear that I hear, or think I hear, the timekeeper. This is always when I am alone in a room, or think I am. I shut the radio off suddenly, and I hear him flitting across the carpet, making a sound about 3 times as loud as a pin. "Hello," I say, but he never answers. Sometimes a waiter does, or a bellboy, or a maid who has crept into the room. On these occasions the timekeeper slips into a closet or under the bed. I never ask the waiter or the bellboy or the maid to look for the hiding man, for consider how it would sound. It would sound like this. "Waiter? Yes, sir? Would you mind looking under the bed? I think there is a timekeeper there." "A timekeeper, sir? I'm sorry, sir, but it sounds as if you said timekeeper, sir." "That's right, timekeeper. There is a timekeeper hiding somewhere in this room, a chap who wears sneakers and a suit of the same design as the wallpaper, probably." "I'm very sorry. Shall I call your doctor?" "No, never mind. It's all right. Let it go." I haven't let anybody call the doctor yet, but I am planning to let one of the waiters do it one of these days, a waiter named Heist. He not only always brings the wrong order to me, but he is also the man who distributes the menus, shoving them under the door. To some people, a menu being shoved under a door would make only a faint moving sound, but to me it sounds like a man stepping on a market basket, and is very disconcerting. So I am going to let Heist call the doctor some day. You know what would happen to a man who phoned a doctor and said, "The gentleman in 916 hears timekeepers, sir"? He would be put away before sundown. I don't know who pays the timekeeper. I do, probably, without knowing it. I can't see my checkbook stubs. It is thoughtful of him at least to carry a watch that makes no sound at all. That would keep me awake at night when he sits in a chair at the foot of my bed. Even the sound of a wristwatch prevents me from sleeping, because it sounds like 2 men trying to take a wheel off a locomotive. If I put stopples in my ears, the racket is deadened somewhat. Then the ticking is fainter and farther away, a comparatively peaceful sound, like 2 men trying to take a rug away from a bulldog. A good man. It was about 5 years ago, just after my great-uncle Malin Taylor left Columbus, Ohio, to live in Puxcotawney, Pennsylvania, that I came across a faded obituary of my great-grandfather, Jacob Fisher, preserved in an old family scrapbook. Jacob, I learned, was born in 1808, one of the 11 children of Michael Fisher, who had built his cabin on the east shore of the Scioto River, south of Columbus, in 1799, the year George Washington died. Jacob Fisher's death notice, headed simply Memorial, recorded that he was survived by 3 sisters and a brother, 6 of his 13 children, 32 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. The rest of the story, except for a single arresting sentence, praised the deceased's homely virtues, a persistent devotion to the Lord, kindliness to his neighbors, and generosity to those in want. The sentence that caught my eye and interest, set austerely apart in a paragraph by itself, read, "In his prime, Jacob Fisher was the strongest man for many miles below the city." That was all. No instances were given of my great-grandfather's physical prowess. In the severe and solemn memorials of 1885 in Ohio, There was no place for vain glorification of the pitiful and transitory clay. I wondered, when I read the obituary, what lay behind that cautious tribute to the earthly power of old Jake Fisher's flesh. It wasn't until I went to Columbus a month ago, and met Mahlon Taylor there on a visit too, that I found out. A far lesser breed of men has succeeded the old gentleman on the American earth, and I tremble to think what he would have said of a great-grandson who turned out to be a writer. Perhaps I can make up for it a little by giving the substance of the story that should have followed that topic sentence left hanging mute and lonely in old Jake's obituary. He would have wanted it there in place of the list of his virtues. Mahlon Taylor, a grand-uncle of mine on my mother's side, is 85 years old, but he looks the same as he did when I last saw him more than 20 years ago. He stands straight, walks spryly, and his mind and memory are as keen as his eyes, with which, without glasses, he can still see to shoot a rabbit or read a book. He has a thick head of white hair, on which people invariably compliment him. His secret is easy and inexpensive. For 30 years he has shampooed his head once a week with Old Dutch cleanser. "I don't know what old Jake used," said Mahlon, "but his hair stayed full and black up to his death. Beard turned gray, but his hair didn't. He died with all his own teeth in his head, too, all except one. That had been knocked out with a brick in a fight." Jake Fisher fought 1,000 fights in his time. In those days, if you went west of the Alleghenies, there was only one way of settling an argument or a difference of opinion. Farther west, they wrestled and gouged out eyes with their thumbnails, but in the Northwest Territory they fought standing up with their fists. Some men would pick up a club or a rock or even a broadaxe, and a few grabbed for their guns, but mostly they slugged it out toe-to-toe. Jake never lost a fight, Mahlon said. He fought men who were hard on their women folks, or were cruel to dumb animals, but mostly he fought to back up his political beliefs, or to defend the divine inspiration of Scripture. "There is too goddamn much blaspheming goes on," he used to say. He was a good man. Jacob Fisher, born in a log cabin when Jefferson was president, was 21 when Andrew Jackson took office. "Your great-grandpa's prime that the fellow speaks of," said Uncle Mahlon, "began about then and lasted up to Cleveland's first term. He couldn't go through another Democratic administration, and so he died." Jake's political bias, it seems, was partly determined by an incident of the War of 1812. General Jackson had ordered the execution of a young soldier who had deserted to visit his dying mother. Jake heard about it from his father, and he never got it out of his mind. He licked every Jackson man he met, once going up onto the platform of a meeting house to knock down a visiting speaker from the East who praised Old Hickory. Afterward, he stopped his buggy beside the man who was walking along the road holding his jaw. "Get in the buggy and I'll take you to the hotel," said Jake. The man refused. "Get in the buggy," roared Jake. The man got in. A fist fight settled an issue once and for all, and subsequent hard feelings were not to be tolerated. If Jake broke a man's ribs or fractured his jaw, he took the man home. Often he sat up all night at the bedside of a vanquished foe, applying arnica or changing bandages. He could assist at the birth of a child, and he had a comforting voice in a house of death. "About all the graves in the old Walnut Hill Cemetery were dug single-handed by Jake," said Uncle Mahlon. "He never allowed nobody to help him." Jacob Fisher built one of the first stone houses south of Columbus, and people used to go out from the town to watch him pick up a 300-pound granite sill and set it in place. "He was only a hair over 5'10", said Uncle Mahlon, "but he weighed 198 pounds, most of it bone and muscle. You couldn't lay your finger between his hip bone and his ribs, he was that close built. He walked so straight he never run his shoes over, heel or sole. They wore out even." Around the house that Jake built grew up a farm of 10,000 acres. Through a part of his vast fields drifted the barges of the Ohio Canal on their way to and from Athens, and across one end of his property the Chillicothe toll pike was cut. Jake owned a great gravel pit, and he allowed the road contractor to use all the gravel he needed, with the understanding that Jake would never have to pay toll. When the pike was finished and the toll gate put up, the agreement was forgotten. The pole would be kept in place across the road when Jake drove along in his buggy. "He'd get out and beat up the toll gate keeper," Uncle Mahlon told me, and then raise the gate and drive on. They kept putting bigger and stronger men on the gate. Jake licked 8 of 'em all told, and finally his patience gave out, and he threatened to go over their heads to their bosses and lick them, and after that they didn't molest him. The gatekeeper would heist the gate when Jake's rig was still a quarter mile away. The canal wove itself into my great-grandfather's saga, too. If you stood on his back porch, you could see the slow boats passing through the land half a mile away. Once in a while, when a barge came along, Jake would cup his hands around his mouth and bellow, "Get me some whiskey!" On the return trip, 5 barrels would be tossed off onto Jake's land. He didn't drink or smoke or chew, but his hired hands did. When he was not yet 40, Jake had 100 Negroes working for him. Each man had a jug and a tin cup, and the barrels were set in a lean-to, and you could get whiskey whenever you wanted it. If a man got mean drunk or lazy drunk, Jake would whip him sober with a hickory whip. The men learned to drink moderately, out of fear of the big man's lash, and also out of a real devotion to him. "Your great-grandpa," said Uncle Malin, "was the first man in Franklin County to sit down at a table with a Negro. This caused a stew and a fret in the Presbyterian Church, but Jake just said, if a man's good enough to work for me, he's good enough to eat with me, and that settled that." One day there was hell and a battle royal along the canal. Jake wandered down to the waterway and witnessed a dismaying spectacle. The bargemen were whipping up ducks. Each of the men held in his hand a long lashed bullwhip. Their sport consisted of casting the whip at ducks floating in the canal in such a way that the far end of the lash wrapped itself several times about a duck's neck. Then they would jerk the bird up onto the barge. The bargemen were expert at this curious pastime. They caught a great many ducks. The ducks were Jake's. He ran down to the towpath, grabbed the tow rope away from the drowsy boy on the mule, and hauled the boat into shore. Then he leaped on board and began to throw men into the water and onto the land. He could throw a 6-foot grown man as far as 25 feet when he was in a rage, said Uncle Malin. A lot of heads cracked and bones broke that day, but nobody was killed. Your great-grandpa never tried to kill anybody except one Indian. He was a good man. I asked about the Indian. There were a great many Indians in central Ohio in the first 30 years of Jake Fisher's prime, descendants perhaps of the braves who fought at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. They plagued Jake because although they couldn't out-wrestle or out-hoist him, they could outrun him. "If I could catch him," he used to say wistfully, "I could hold him." He never gave up trying. Once, over by the old Deer Lick west of the river, Uncle Malin told me, he challenged an Indian to a foot race, see which one could reach an old elm tree first. The Indian won by a couple of strides. Your great-grandpa ran back and got his gun where he had left it and shot the Indian. He wasn't killed, but he was hurt bad. Jake carried him to his own home and nursed him back to life. Old Fisher didn't get more than 2-3 hours sleep a night for weeks, sitting up with that Indian. The fellow thought he was going to die, so he confessed to his sins and crimes, which included most of the thieving and skullduggery that had gone on in the county for the past 5 years. Your great-grandpa never gave him away to the authorities. Jake always said the Lord God Almighty disturbed his aim the day he shot that Indian. Shortly after that, Jake became captain of a horse militia company, whose main duty was to keep order at public hangings.